No, right now, here's Paco.
Hello,
Hi,
how are you?
how are you? Good to see you again.
Te aplauden, compadre. Buenas noches de nuevo. En estos encuentros en un zócalo medio enloquecido, y que no baja el calor ni la velocidad. Es un placer tenerte con nosotros como un referente al pensamiento crítico libertario. Muchas gracias por estar en México de nuevo. ¿Recibe imágenes del público, José Ramón? Sí, recibe imágenes del público. Ok. Va. Yo creo que lo primero que podríamos decir es que los cambios profundos que se han producido en México de alguna manera restablecen la conexión con Estados Unidos. Y no me refiero a las conexiones formales con el Estados Unidos de Trump, me refiero a las conexiones reales de país a país. Alguna vez en broma dije que había que bombardear algunos lugares de los Estados Unidos con libros tuyos y películas de Rita Hayworth cuando se quita el guante. Queríamos preguntarte sobre todo ¿cómo ves la perspectiva de unas relaciones México-Estados Unidos desde abajo en estos momentos?
That's the kind of relationship that can be established and can be very meaningful. So just as an example, I'm now living in Arizona, Tucson. I teach at the University of Arizona. I co-teach a course on radical politics with a colleague and friend here, and we have the course connected live to a university in Mexico, Hermosillo, and are planning to extend it to other universities. This is arranged, we're now trying to arrange it so that there'll be real interaction. The Mexican students will be able to participate directly in the sessions. This is one of many kinds of relationships that can be set up, including visits in both directions and so on. And there are many others. Some of them are symbolic. You probably saw the reports of the seesaws at the border fence. These boards that children go up and down on. One side was in Mexico, one side was in the United States across the border. A symbolic indication of the kinds of relationships that ought to be established, as well as a protest against the obscene construction of the border. But there are many other kinds of connections.
We are applauding your answer now.
La necesaria relación entre dos pueblos que están separados por 1 metro de frontera plantearía necesariamente una conexión desde abajo en términos de los problemas comunes que tenemos, porque de repente nos pensamos como los latinoamericanos que sufren la presencia de los Estados Unidos. From Latin America that suffer
the injustices committed by the United States, and perhaps that's not exactly the way it is because
pero al mismo tiempo y las injusticias que sufre el pueblo norteamericano,
the injustices that the American people from below are as well suffering, perhaps would join us.
Este es un momento histórico en que no está muy claro quién puede ayudar a quién.
Many examples of what you're describing. In fact, one of them is on the front pages today, the battle between the drug cartels and the Mexican state. The United States is very deeply involved in that. The drug cartels would not exist if it were not for the enormous demand for drugs and the criminalization of drugs in the United States.
En México es muy común decir, pobre México, tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de los Estados Unidos, frase que se atribuye a muchos personajes, entre ellos a Porfirio Díaz. Me gustaría invertir la frase, y decir, pobres de los Estados Unidos, tan cerca de México y tan lejos de lo mejor de su historia. Y Noam, te digo esto porque yo no podría pensar en mí mismo sin 200 referentes de la cultura norteamericana que me han formado. Desde las mejores novelas de Chandler y Hammett, Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, hasta los libros de Howard Fast, hasta tus primeros alegatos contra la guerra de Vietnam, y puedo estar horas diciendo obras de teatro, películas, canciones, ¿sí? ¿Qué sería de mí sin Blowing in the Wind? ¿No? ¿A dónde quiero llevarte? A la idea de que el único puente real a partir del que podemos crear una nueva relación con los Estados Unidos es la cultura.
Yeah, that's certainly true. In where I live in Tucson, right north of the border, about almost half the population is Mexican American. In the university where I teach, again, almost half the students are Mexican American, and there's a considerable cultural integration. And of course, Mexican music, food, literature are widely read, and so on. So yes, those are modes of interaction. But I think there are also just people-to-people connections that can be developed. In fact, there are many very common concerns. One common concern is, in fact, the border, the idea of militarization of the border, which really goes back to Bill Clinton and NAFTA, which is when it started, and has, of course, been extended into an extremely ugly process under Trump. It's a common interest of the people in Mexico and the United States to abolish that and to allow free transit across the border. We should be aiming for something like the Schengen Agreement in Europe, which allows free movement within the European Union in the member states. That's what we should have between Mexico and the United States. And it's a common concern.
Ha sido un analista político permanente en los últimos 50 años o 40 años. Danos una buena noticia. ¿Donald Trump se queda o se va?
In fact, if you look at there is some standard models that are used to predict elections. What they usually find is that the election is determined substantially by people's perceptions about the state of the economy, not the actual state, but people's perceptions. Is it getting better or is it getting worse, and so on? By those models are predicting that unless there's a recession, Trump would probably win. On the other hand, there are many other factors. The things that he's doing are often just atrocious, and some of them will affect not only the United States and Mexico, but the entire world. So the worst and the most horrendous of the Trump policies are his attitude towards global warming. this is actually the whole Republican Party, but he's leading it. We know, or we should know, that we have only a few years to try to avert serious threats to the survival of organized human society. Yeah. Well, this is a really existential crisis. Every country in the world is trying to do something about it, some more, some less. The United States is alone under Trump in trying to race towards destruction as quickly as possible. That will, if another 4 years of Trump might literally be a death knell for the species. That's not a joke. This is vastly more serious than the things that are discussed, like, you know, his telephone call to the Prime Minister of Ukraine and so on. But this is really lethal. And of course it'll affect Mexico directly. The Gulf of Mexico can be simply poisoned by oil extraction. Mexico itself, large parts will become virtually unlivable because of the heat. And in fact, the sea level will be rising maybe several feet. This is just destruction beyond what can be imagined. Other parts of the world are already becoming virtually uninhabitable. The temperatures in India this summer went up to 50 degrees centigrade. In Qatar, on the Gulf, they're now at the point where they not only have to air condition buildings, but they have to air condition the outdoors because people can't survive in the extreme heat. In Japan, an advanced industrial country, they had a huge typhoon which was very destructive, and they're now beginning to wonder whether there is any point in even trying to develop barriers against the extremely severe storms that are coming. We're facing a major crisis. And, well, as I was saying, this 4 years more of Trump will possibly doom the human society to the virtual destruction from climate change, from global warming. But that's only one of two major crises. The other, which is not discussed very much, is the growing and very severe threat of nuclear war. Trump just abolished the major arms treaty, which was preventing a confrontation in Europe from developing into nuclear war, signed by Reagan and Gorbachev. It has just been announced that he's going to abandon the Outer Space Treaty, which blocks developing military forces in space. Meanwhile, right after dismantling the INF, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, Trump immediately, his Pentagon under Trump tested a missile which violates the treaty, virtually pleading with the Russians to reciprocate. This is opening the door to development of massive new techniques of mutual destruction, in fact, global destruction. Very little attention is being paid to it. Another few years, we may not survive that either. It's a very significant election. It may determine the fate of the human species.
Tal vez podría hacer yo una pregunta.
Plantea que en los que en los primeros 4 años de un gobierno norteamericano los presidentes tienden a ser menos beligerantes para desatar en los siguientes una política más dura, ya sin espacio de reelección. Piensa que esperaríamos, en caso de reelección de Trump, una política aún más beligerante, más agresiva.
Well, Trump is not a conventional president. There's never been a president in the past who describes himself as the chosen one while he's looking to heaven before an adoring crowd, or a president who speaks of his his great wisdom and unparalleled abilities. We've never had a president where the Secretary of State, who's supposed to be a serious person, says the president was sent by God to protect Israel from Iran. We're off in a new dimension, which has never existed in the past. It is quite possible Trump talks about withdrawing troops from the Middle East. He's doing the opposite. He's sending troops to the Middle East. 2,000 troops were just sent to Saudi Arabia to help accelerate their war in Yemen, which is destroying the country. His conflict with Iran could, just by accident, break out into some incident that could escalate into a major war in the region. This is placed, just look point by point, let's take the Russian border. The treaty that Trump just abrogated had to do with East-West confrontations in Europe by eliminating, when Reagan and Gorbachev decided to eliminate short-range missiles, that gave us 20 years of peace in Europe. Now that's gone. The United States has installations, threatening installations, right on the border of Europe, of Russia. There are threatening actions actually on both sides, but the most provocative are from NATO. Under Trump, nobody knows where that'll go next.
Okay, let me translate that, please.
There's another point that may sound exotic, but it's being discussed by serious political analysts, and it's a real worry. You said that Trump won't have to worry in his second term about being elected again. Is that true? Suppose he decides not to leave office. Okay. Then what happens? You have murderous drug cartels. The United States has heavily armed white supremacist militias, which outmatch local forces. They're wildly in favor of Trump, who they see as protecting white supremacy against all these terrible people who are trying to destroy our white Christian civilization. Suppose he calls on them to revolt. Well, the U.S. Army could overcome them, but what an army does depends on not the generals, but the colonels. What are they going to say? We could be facing a real crisis. In fact, that could even happen if he doesn't win the 2020 election. Suppose he doesn't concede. Suppose he said it was faked by illegal immigrants, Mexicans, who were voting, who were brought in by the Democrats to vote for them. And this same scenario plays out. I don't say it's likely, but it's not impossible. The United States is in a very strange situation now. Trump represents extremely dangerous tendencies within the country. A large part of the country, it's a country where white supremacy is very profound, very deeply rooted, and so is fundamentalist Christianity. This leads to a picture where large segments of the population recognize that under current tendencies, whites will be a minority, and white Christian, what they call Anglo-Saxon civilization, is in danger. Remember, this is a country where people have assault rifles and hidden in their garages. Nobody knows what's going to happen under those circumstances.
No, después de un panorama tan absolutamente desalentador como el que acabas de trazar, en México, que en estos momentos estamos viviendo un clima de relativa euforia, estuviste a punto de tirarnos un cubo de hielo sobre nuestras espaldas.
And right now you are just about to throw a big block of ice upon our backs.
Digamos que todavía podemos. Dinos cómo podemos ayudar a que no se reelija Trump los mexicanos.
How could the Mexican population help Trump not to be re-elected?
Well, there's not much that Mexicans can do, but there's quite a lot that Americans can do, and in fact are doing. I gave a pessimistic picture, but there are many reasons for optimism. There have been, for the first time in many years, there's a real opposition in the United States, and mainly among young people, opposition to the neoliberal programs of the past 40 years, which have been very harmful. There's a move towards social democracy, which is new. There's young people are acting very effectively to counter the dangerous developments we're talking about. So just to give you one example, one of many, some form of what's called Green New Deal is essential for the survival of the species. A couple of years ago, nobody was even dreaming about it. Now it's in the center of attention, the legislative agenda. Corporations are being forced to pay attention to it. What happened? A small group of young people, Sunrise Movement, agitated for this, began to take direct action, like sitting in congressional offices. They got support from some of the young women in Congress, especially Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who were elected, in fact, on a wave of popular activism. She supported it, others did. Now it's a major issue. It might save us. And there are many cases like that. The country is in a kind of ferment. It's not clear which direction it'll go. But there are many reasons for hope. And like right here in Tucson, where I live, it's not far from the border. There's very substantial support in the city for helping refugees who are fleeing from misery and dying in the desert. There are groups who go out into the desert to leave bottles of water, to offer medical aid, and so on.
Let me translate that, please.
Yeah.
Le pregunté que quién considera él que podría.
Sí, ¿quién piensa que puede ser una opción para derrotar a Trump en las próximas elecciones? Y en particular pregunta por Bernie Sanders.
The media portray him in the most negative possible way, dismiss him, disparage him. I think he'll be prevented from gaining the nomination. Could be Elizabeth Warren, who's certainly far better than Trump. In fact, almost anyone is. But I think it's very difficult at this point to predict the outcome of the election. There are conflicting forces on almost all issues, even outside of the immediate political domain. Like, for example, what I've described, the Green New Deal, the support for refugees. There's a proposal right now where I live in Tucson to turn Tucson into a sanctuary city, which will welcome and protect people who manage to escape the border patrol monstrosities. These are tendencies all over the country, and they could prevail. what Mexicans can do, since you asked that, is to try to create in Mexico a model, a demonstration of where a forward-looking, progressive society could advance. And there are enough interactions so that can have an effect on what will happen here. But I'll just finish by saying that we live in a moment of truly existential crisis. What happens in the next few years will determine the fate of human society. That has never been true in the past, but it is true now. And the kinds of issues we've been discussing cannot be dismissed. They have to be dealt with urgently and with dedication, not only on both sides of the border, but in fact in the world. And what happens here will have an immense effect.
Y le gustaría a Chomsky cerrar con la siguiente reflexión. Algo que sí puede hacer el pueblo de México para demostrarle al pueblo norteamericano lo conveniente que es tener un gobierno socialdemócrata es progresar de una manera tal que nos convirtamos en un ejemplo a seguir para ellos, que nuestras relaciones sociopolíticas mejorasen de tal manera que entonces los norteamericanos volteasen hacia el sur y dijeran, mira lo que se puede hacer, ¿no? Teniendo un gobierno socialdemócrata. Y finalmente, bueno, nos encontramos al filo de lo que va a determinar el destino de la humanidad, para bien o mal, en los siguientes 20 años. Él dice, esto se ha dicho muchas veces, pero nunca había sido cierto, pero en esta ocasión sí es cierto. Lo que se decida ahora es lo que va a desembocar, en lo que va a desembocar la humanidad.
Corta.
Thank you very much. We are very thankful to have you once again among us.
Muchas gracias. Ha sido un placer tenerte de nuevo con nosotros en el Zócalo de la Ciudad de México.